join the webinar. So we suggest that you go ahead and mute yourself on your end just to cut down on background noise. And then that way, if you want, when we do the question and answer back and forth, you can simply unmute yourself when you want to jump on in. You can also use the chat window to ask questions if you wanted to do that offline, and so otherwise feel more than free to use any of those methods to provide feedback. I'm going to let Allison introduce herself really quickly. Denise has a few comments to add, and then we are going to jump right into the webinar. So Allison, want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, so this is Allison Malouf with Cap Law. And I was the main person at Cap Law who worked with Jarl on putting together these tools, and so I'm going to spend some time today just walking through those and introducing everybody to them, and I'm looking forward to that, so thanks.
Great, thanks, Allison. And I'm going to turn it over to Denise for a few general announcements and updates, and then we'll go on to the webinar.
Thanks,
Denise?
Jarl. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being on today. We are excited by today's meeting. I know we want to have a dialogue about the tools and resources we're going to see here today, so it is in a meeting setting, so you can unmute yourself, you can jump in. I'm looking at the attendance list, and I think you can see the attendance list as well on the right-hand side of your screen to see who is in the room, in essence. This is for state associations. We wanted to run this by you with state associations first. We want to get your feedback. We're going to talk about how we're going to implement and check in on this at our January conference as well on that state association track. So I'm glad you're here today. Just a couple of quick announcements or reminders. The public charge comments. I know we have probably over 200 CAPs and associations in state offices on our webinar last week that we did in partnership with NASCAS and Cap Law, which is phenomenal. And the public charge sample was developed by Veronica over at Cap Law. Those are due Monday at the latest, so I'm planning on uploading mine tomorrow. I hope that you will upload comments as well. We know some of you already have, and congratulations to Merritt Mount out in Washington, who as the state association got a great op-ed published on the public charge. The second issue is many of you know that we've been working on a community action impact report with our communications firm. Some of you sit on our advisory committee. I just want you to put a placeholder on your calendar for Thursday, January 24th. Now, I know that's about, 8 weeks away, something like that. But I want you to put a placeholder on that. We'll talk more about it as we get closer. But that's going to be our big public launch engagement day. We plan on releasing the report initially, kind of a soft launch at our conference. We'll be working with you and our comms consultants, along with Catherine Clausen from OACA, Ohio, who's been helping us out on helping state associations also develop tools and resources to help promote the impact report. So you're the first to hear it. We decided on the date this morning, so put a placeholder in on Thursday, January 24th. The third piece that I would have, I referenced it, is the state association track at our winter conference. I have a meeting on Monday with Alliance for Justice. We'll be doing some of the primary work around the advocacy side of the equation during those the Wednesday and Thursday of that week in New Orleans. We will also have Kediyun formerly from Springboard, but the consultant who worked on our comms plan, along with Catherine, also meet with us as part of that track around branding, communications, and messaging around advocacy. And then on Friday, I know Allison will be joining us to talk more about the tools that you're seeing here today and the content. I know we have a web meeting also in early January to do additional prep for that session. So it's a dedicated track. State associations will attend the plenary sessions, all the meals, the receptions. So we do ask that you register. We've had a great turnout so far from state associations. I hope that every association is able to send somebody to that track. So those are my primary announcements. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jarl for today's conversation. But again, we want it to be a conversation. So this comes from you as state associations, and Jarl will reference that a bit here this afternoon. So if it's not working, we want to fix it so when it's ready to go live and out there with a big launch, we'll be able to make it right for you.
That's right, absolutely. And these are resources that we're hoping you use. You are the primary audience for these resources, so we're really relying on you to tell us what's working, what's not, and what we need to do to just continually improve what we're able to provide you in terms of TNTA resources. So, next slide. All right, so quick agenda. I just wanted to start off with some brief background on the board training tools and suggested uses for the tools. Also wanted to see what ideas that you had about potentially using these resources. Then I'm going to kick it back to Allison, who's going to walk us through just some examples of what's in the toolkit, so you get a general sense of what's there, hopefully some additional ideas about how you might adapt it. Allison will have some, I think, good tips and tricks for you. And then finally, we want to wrap it up with a discussion, like Denise said, to get your feedback on how we can continue to support our state associations, but also, I think most importantly, make sure that our agencies have strong and high-functioning boards.
I'd also add, if you want another agenda item added to this, put it in the chat window, and we'll see what we can do to make sure to circle back to some key issues that you want to talk about. So please put it in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and if there's anything related to board development, board training, orientation, any of the above, this is certainly the forum to discuss it. Okay. So, background and suggested uses. So where did this resource come from? Next. So the idea for this board training toolkit came out of our first regional training and technical assistance initiative meeting. Probably about half of you have been through those at this point, and it was suggested that what we really needed was a one-stop shop for board training resources. We had initially talked about doing some targeted work in 4A, but it quickly became apparent that this was a network-wide need, and so that's why it's taken us a little bit more time, but we really wanted to make sure that we had a robust set of resources to support board training, and it's obviously a technical and complex issue. And so the idea behind the board training resources is that there would be a common playbook that we could pull from. And what we heard at these regional meetings was different people had access to different resources, people had different areas of expertise in terms of board training, so capacity is unevenly distributed, and sometimes there's varying approaches in terms of the strategies different states use when it comes to board training, and it's a complex issue. Obviously, agencies do some of their own board training. Some of that is then supplemented by state associations, and sometimes other outside trainers as well. So there are a lot of moving parts, and so the idea was to put together a set of resources that would be that common one-stop shop, but also encourage state associations to talk to their member agencies and put together an overall board training strategy. Obviously, we now have our state TNTA plans that you all have filled out now a couple of times, and so our thinking is that almost in miniature there would be a board training plan that could be a component of that overall state TNTA plan to help make sure that we're harmonizing our approaches to board training and really make sure that there's a big picture that informs how we do our capacity building.
Let me add something to that just to make sure folks who are already doing a lot of board training don't freak out, right? We're not looking to standardize anybody who has a robust training product already for boards, and many of you are doing that already. So this is in a way to try to provide some standardized content. If you would like to use it, it's going to be available to you. We see state associations as being one of the key conveyors. So we don't want you to walk away from here saying, boy, the partnership is going to make me use this stuff now. That's not the case. We hope that this is a resource for you to access across a variety of other resources that you're looking at.
Right, absolutely. And of course, we've been asking you for...
If I could just add one part to that, when we at Cap Law do trainings, we often have participants in state associations ask us for our slides. And so this is also an attempt to kind of have a more formalized version of those slides and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And so, to help you guys when you're interested in the materials that we're presenting on, to help you actually use and present those materials either at state associations when you take them back to your states or with your individual CAAs if you want to pass it along to them. So I'll just add that to the mix too. Right,
and it's meant to be tweaked, adapted to your heart's content. Right. So we wanted to start off with some ideas for using these tools, but also give you a chance to talk a little bit how you're currently doing board training, how you might see these tools being used, and then after Allison talks a little bit more about the content, we'll ask you for additional feedback on other resources, other ways to support you on board training, orientation, and development. So obviously, state associations can engage their network to develop that overall board training TNTA plan that I was talking about. So I think most state associations have their EDs on their, of their state networks on their board. So at a board retreat for your state association, you could talk through your overall training strategy, what issues you could address, and there's a separate set of slides Allison will show you that's set up to help you facilitate that conversation. You can certainly offer train-the-trainer workshops for state association and agency staff to build capacity. So the idea is really to use these tools and resources as a capacity building support. And so obviously, I'm sure many of you already do this as a matter of course, but we're really hoping these tools are helpful for you to continue to build capacity at the state level, but also among your local agencies. You could also work directly with your agencies to help them develop board orientation and development training plans. So those slides that Allison is going to show you could also be used by an agency to put together their agency level approach to board training. You could also use the toolkit to provide regular trainings via webinars, conferences, and in-person trainings. There are no copyrights on these slides. Like I said, they're meant to be adapted and used. And so we really hope they become that resource to help do that sort of high-intensity training that you often need around board issues. And then finally, you can use RPIC calls and similar forums to discuss how you're going about doing board training at the state and agency level, what lessons you've learned, and also to share resources. So we're hoping a number of ways, but also wanted to see if folks had any other ideas for how you might engage or use these resources or other resources that you know about. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have an idea, a comment, anything to help us get going, and then I'll turn it over to Allison. Thoughts from folks on the phone? Going once, going twice. And again, remember, you can always enter something in the chat window, but we will circle back to this question at the end of the webinar. So, Alice, Denise?
I will say that, given what Jarl said, you can hear why your feedback is going to be critical, right? If these become kind of a standing tool and resource, they need to be right, they need to be usable, they need to be understood by the lay board member, and so your feedback is going to be critically important. So, yep. Allison?
Good. So I'll get going on talking about the tools themselves. So I just want to walk through the different tools. So as Charles said, we created two different tools. The first one is really focused on how you develop a board training strategy. And then the second one is walking through a board, the roles and responsibilities of board members. So I wanted to first kind of show everybody where they live on our website. And there's hope at CAPLAW that within the near future, we will have a new website, and we'll probably have to do this part of the webinar again if we do that, because you won't know where this stuff lives by that point. But for now, so you'll see here is a screenshot of CAPLAW's homepage, and you'll see that where the red arrow pops up on your screen is pointing towards publications. So when you click on that publications highlighted on the word, it'll take you to this page here, which I'm guessing many of you have already been to. And when you get to this page for other resources that we have, when you get to this page, you'll see that the link for the page you'll see up at the top. And then you'll also see with the red arrow the board, developing a board training strategy, where that resource lives on our website, and then also the where the training and orientation tools for tripartite boards lives, and then you'll see with the other arrows that have popped up there the link that you would click on to actually get to the publication. So as many of you guys are probably familiar with at this point, we like to and need to collect just a little bit of data for our purposes with regards to who is downloading and using our materials. We keep this data only for ourselves and only for our own tracking, and we don't release that information to anyone. So once you put in your information, it will take you to where the materials actually live on our website, this web page here that you see in front of you. And you'll see for the developing a board training strategy, there's a little explanation on the web page as to what this is about, which Jarl went into, and I'll discuss in a little bit more detail as we move along. But you'll also see that there's an introduction, and I'm going to show you that introduction in just a second. And then there's also the actual PowerPoint. And as Jarl said, this PowerPoint is intended for you to take, to use, and you'll see that the design of the PowerPoint is pretty simplistic. It's that way for a reason. You can use it as is, or you can add things to it or pull slides from it and put it into your own PowerPoint. So as I mentioned, this is basically sort of a screenshot of the introduction to the Developing a Board Training Strategy tool, the PowerPoint. And we just generally talk about some of what Charles mentioned here today about the motivation behind the tool, how you would use the tool. And then I was particularly interested in showing you this introduction because I wanted to point out that it does have hyperlinks in the resource, these couple of pages, for you to access some other resources that we at CAPLAW often access. These are the websites that we will often use to get information around governance issues because, as many of you know, a lot of the same issues that community action agency boards face are not that different than just a regular nonprofit board. So a lot of information on these websites are just as useful. And I tried to give an example, as you'll see in the chart, of the different types of the type of resource you might find. So sometimes it's a webinar, sometimes it's a template. Sometimes it's just an article that the board could read, or maybe there's a committee of the board, of the Community Action Agency board, could access it to do further research and then report back. So I also want to point out, too, above the chart, as you might see on the screen, you'll see a hyperlink that says Board Training Tools, and that does link to the YouTube page where you can find the Illinois Association of Community Action Agencies. I'm not sure if they're on the call today, but they have developed a whole series of board training tools. And they are sometimes unique to Illinois, but in general, I think they're a great resource and an introduction to the Community Action Network. So just some other resources for you guys to use and think about. So this is the cover page for the Developing a Board Training Strategy. So this is sort of a funny webinar that we're doing today because we have two PowerPoints within one PowerPoint. So when you see a header slide like this in these slides for the webinar today, this header slide is marking when I'm going to start talking about slides that are in this Developing a Board Training Strategy. So I just pulled a few slides from each of the two PowerPoints that we created so that you could get a flavor and a taste of what's in these materials and how they could really be useful to you. And so I wanted to point out, just as I think Jarl was saying, these slides are really intended for you to add your information right into them. So you'll see there are brackets around training, date. If you've got a logo for your community, your state association, if you want your community action agencies to try to use some of these resources, they can throw their trainer logos in there, website or email, all that great information. So this slide is the agenda slide for the Developing a Board Training Strategy PowerPoint tool that we are encouraging everyone to use. And so when you, as the state association trainer, get up and to try to talk to community action agencies in your network about what is the best way to receive resources, information around governance matters, this is the set of slides that we would suggest that you might try to use. Again, as Denise is saying, you might have a strategy in place that is working well for your state association, and if you do, that's great for your network, if in your state, but if not, or maybe you just want to spice it up a bit, this is an option for you to look at. And so you'll see that we walk through, as in beginning this presentation, if we ourselves were to give it, and I believe Eleanor Evans, our executive director, gave parts of this presentation at the Partnership's annual conference this past summer. But you'll see when you open up this slide, below it is the slide is annotated. So we've basically taken every single slide in both presentations and written out what we would say if we were doing this presentation. That doesn't mean that there's not more to say about this slide, so don't think that what we say is the be-all and end-all. It definitely isn't. It just is there to help you present on these slides or help to add to what you might say when presenting this slide. It also gives you a window into our perspective on how this information should be conveyed. You'll also see we have these notes to presenters, and those notes basically sort of try to give you a little bit of logistical background information sometimes, letting you know if the slide is animated, might give you a little bit of background about the purpose of this information or the slide. So it wouldn't be information that you would share with the workshop participants, just information as a presenter that's helpful to you in presenting the slides. The information all above the note to presenter is information that, let's say you were giving a webinar. Not that I suggest that you just read notes off of the note pages. They can always tell that you're doing that. And no matter how hard you try, I feel like everyone can always tell. But you could do that. You could just read the notes, and that would be the information that you would be conveying for this slide. So I just want to show you a few more slides. So with that agenda, we had all of those questions for this presentation. So each slide after that agenda slide walks through each of those questions. And again, this presentation in particular is really intended to generate conversation in a network around developing training strategies and developing resources. So this is just an example of this next slide. So the why on the agenda slide, you're asking why conduct a board training. And so this is educating your audience on why you're even engaging in this conversation with them. Again, every single slide is annotated. As we all know, one of the main reasons we're doing this is because of the organizational standards. So this is something that's important for all boards to do, even if you weren't subject to a specific requirement to do training. So we talk about that with this slide. So this is also to give you comfort that with both presentations, this one and the next one, we are referencing the organizational standards, including them in the materials. Also in this presentation, because sometimes we find there is some confusion, rightly so, around what in the world is the difference between an orientation and a training. This set of slides is really focused on developing a board training strategy. When you're talking about orientation, you're really more talking about sort of a beginning one-stop, one-stop shop sort of, here we're going to start you off and give you some background information, whereas the training is really more of an ongoing process. And so this slide, as you see, I'm going to quickly click through it, is part of the PowerPoint that we're providing you. And it, I think in a nice way, helps to differentiate for the audience that you'll be speaking with the difference between the two types of activities that boards will engage in with regards to educating themselves. The orientation activity, which as you'll see on the left, really an overview highlighting CAA-specific information, so information that's very specific to your CAA, not necessarily talking about the general network. Whereas when you're doing training, it occurs within 2 years because that's a requirement of the organizational standards, but you're really taking more specific topics and drilling down into those specific topics. And those trainings, again, might be presented in-house or out-of-house. All right. So this is just another snapshot of, let's say, gosh, I wish I had taken notes about what Allison had said with regards to that slide. Well, you don't need to. Allison took those notes for you. They're on the bottom of that slide, and they're there for you to recite and use and learn from. So don't hesitate to do so. And this is just another example of the slides that are in this PowerPoint. You'll see here we list out different subject areas that could make up orientation and also be a part of a training strategy. I think that's oftentimes why orientation and training gets confused, because many of the topics are the same. I think a key difference, which I've already mentioned, is the depth with which you speak about each topic. With orientation, you really don't have time to go, deep into a particular topic. You're just trying to give people a flavor. You're trying to engage them in your organization. That's what the board should be thinking about when they're doing orientation. So this just helps when you're discussing how to develop a training strategy. These are some topics to throw out to your group and say, hey, these are topics we think would make up part of a good governance training strategy. What do you think? Do you think that these are the topics that should be focused on? We're going to put together a 2-year training strategy for community action agency boards in our state. So that's kind of the approach to that slide. All right, so that's all. There are 14 to 16 slides in that developing a training strategy, a board training strategy. So as you see, I only touched on a couple of them, but really just trying to get the flavor of those and hopefully get you guys excited about that resource, but able to start giving us feedback as you look at it, and hopefully I've given you a better understanding of how we envision that resource being used. So as you're reading it and looking at it, you're able to give comments towards that goal. So I guess I'll pause here for just a minute before I dive into the next tool that we developed and see if anyone has any questions or thoughts about this.
Got a shout out from Illinois, thanking you for the just a shout out.
I'm thanking you for thanking me for thanking you.
So you can unmute yourself or put something in chat. Now we're going to move into the second phase here in a moment, which is the training slides and the content behind it. So this is the introductory piece. So it looks like we have a chat came through. Let's see. Excellent work. It's going to be a big help to have the notes pages. And those of you who are Roma trainers can empathize, I think, with what Allison was saying. She says you don't have to read them, and everyone can tell when you read them, like you do when you're sometimes becoming a certified Roma trainer. We're not mandating a script by any stretch. So good. I'm glad you're liking the notes pages.
Yeah, and really, as you guys use these resources, as Denise said, they're really intended to be a living document. Both of these resources are. So if you use them and you think to yourself, gosh, Cap Law really missed a main point here that we usually discuss, please reach out to us, to Jarl, and share your feedback with us, because, it really does take everybody in the network to develop strong materials for everybody else to use. So that's the kind of feedback we're looking for with this stuff.
And Allison, we had a question come in. Will this training benefit both public and private agencies? And that is an excellent question. And the answer is a provisional yes, because we are working with CAPLA in the next year of the Organizational Standards Center of Excellence, which is now, to develop similar training modules tailored specifically for public agencies. So I'm sure Allison can provide a little bit more detail about what in the current slide decks might be of help to public agencies. CAPLA obviously has additional resources tailored to public agencies, but the plan now is to do a similar set of slides that do address issues specific to our public CAPs. Allison, any other thoughts or comments?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that was actually going to be the beginning of this next, my discussion of this next tool. So the developing a training strategy is pretty, how do I say this? It's not unique to necessarily to a nonprofit versus a public CAA. So if you were looking for something to go ahead and start using, you could use that. Now we are going to look at both tools from the perspective of a public CAA. So it is likely that we may tweak the developing a training strategy to be more in line with some of the additional topics that you would, sort of that slide that I showed you with all the different subject matters, that would be slightly different or could be slightly different for a public CAA. So some tweaks like that. However, with this next tool, which is the tool that is really intended to do a deeper dive or do a deep dive into a board member's roles and responsibilities and the board as a whole. This one is specific to nonprofit community action agencies, and as Charles said, we will be developing a version of this that is specific for public community action agencies, because there are some key differences between the two that really, I think ultimately we think it's easiest just to have two separate presentations. However, if you are doing a joint training where you're going to have public and nonprofit community action agencies in the room, you can pull from each, slides from each, and combine them yourself if that is the easier way. One of the reasons for not doing that at this stage was because there are actually, and I don't want everybody to freak out, but there's 122 slides that are part of this training tool. And so it's really robust, and I'm going to walk us through that now so that you don't freak out about how is this ever going to be useful to us with so many slides. But I'll show you how it can be useful to you. So I'm going to do that. So this is, I'm not going through again that you go to our homepage, you click on resources, you click publications, it takes you to our publications page, you click on the view this resource for the training and orientation tool for tripartite boards. And then when you do that, you get to this form page where you would put in your information. And then that will bring you to the web page that has all the different sections and aspects of the tool for training boards on their roles and responsibilities. And so you'll see here that with this tool, just like with the training strategy tool, there is an introduction that we recommend that you download and read, and it gives you some tips about presenting using these materials. It's a very brief 1.5-page introduction. So if, let's say, you were doing a board retreat or you were working with a community action agency that is doing a board retreat and they were looking for a resource to be able to discuss roles and responsibilities at that retreat, and you wanted to get the full PowerPoint, that would be this link right here where the second red arrow is where you would find that. However, our general thought is that this tool will be used in sections and pieces. So you'll see where it says download by individual sections, and that red arrow is marking the beginning of those different sections. And so today, on today's call, I'm going to walk through the real briefly excerpts of slides from the 5 main sections. And you'll see at the bottom the key responsibilities of the tripartite board is then broken up into 6 additional sections. So you could either do the key board responsibilities all as one. That's what that key responsibilities of the tripartite board link is, or you can pull out an individual section. So for today's webinar, I've just pulled out an individual section from that overall key responsibilities of the tripartite board section to show you sort of what those different sections look like. All right, so just like with developing a board training strategy, you have your header slide, which is just begging to be customized by you guys or anybody who is doing some training on roles and responsibilities, and the red arrows are sort of pointing to those areas where you would do that customization of this slide for your purposes. You'll also see here, this is the agenda for the full PowerPoint. It looks, the bullets here are the exact same bullets of the 5 sections that were on that web page. So today, again, I'm going to briefly walk through some excerpts from each of those sections so that you can get a taste, a flavor of what is in this presentation that can be used by you guys or passed along to your community action agencies to use to conduct training. So we've included just a very brief section in this PowerPoint to encourage, as a part of a training, the introduction of individuals that are participating in the training. We have found, the partnership has found, and maybe you guys have also found, that doing so really helps to get the crowd kind of warmed up and going. We don't have enough money to pay for a comic to come in and warm up the crowd, so we got to do it ourselves, and we got to rely on everybody there to help us do that. So this is just an example of what one of those slides in this section looks like. You may have your own methods for doing this. So again, you're not required to do something like this, but you could ask, who do we have in the room with us today? And then on this slide, you'll see you can pull up board member and have the board members raise their hand, board chair, executive director, so forth and so on. We do have notes in the notes section explaining the different ways that you could approach this particular slide if you choose to use it in your presentation. I always find, no matter how many different people I try to mention, there's always somebody in the room who I have no idea, doesn't raise their hand for any of these boxes. So I always think it's helpful to just find out who else is there. You'll see too, I have in here state CSBG office staff. That's a really important group to ask about. We have found in our presentations having state CSBG office staff in a room can affect the dialogue and also may affect how you decide to present the slides. So just keep that in mind. We also talk about the next big section out of the 5 that we discussed are the legal requirements governing tripartite boards. It's really hard to make this stuff interesting. I'm not sure we were completely successful doing so with this set of slides, but we keep trying. So just pipe up if you have ideas. So as you'll see when you dive into this section, if you were to do this, and I would recommend if you are going to do this section that you do it as maybe a separate section. And, you know, if the board members are asking questions about why do we have to do this and why do we have to do that, if CAAs are finding that or state associations are finding that the CAAs are complaining about their boards asking those questions, this is a good section of the presentation to conduct. We walk through each of the different laws that apply to community action agency boards, and as you'll see on this slide, we also try to explain. So with this opening heading slide, we try to explain how these laws or why these laws apply to a community action agency board. So we actually give some nice background as to, well, why do I care about the State Nonprofit Corporation Act? Or what do you mean that the Internal Revenue Service tax-exempt organization requirements apply to me? Why is that? You know, for nonprofit boards, I believe every community action agency nonprofit is a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, and there are governance requirements that come out of having that status. So we briefly address that in each of these little paragraphs here. So this is a hefty slide, animated it so you could go through one bubble at a time, but wanted everyone to see all the different bubbles. Lightly, this is something that's just meant to be a light overview of all the different requirements, explaining why they apply. And then we have a slide for each requirement to sort of more generally discuss how they apply to the Community Action Agency Board. So we're trying to kind of highlight the big takeaways from each of those legal requirements. So there's slides, again, for each of those bubbles. We begin each of those slides with the true false to try to stimulate some kind of understanding or interest. Also with quiz questions, people tend to remember, especially when they get the question wrong. They tend to remember the information on the slide. And so then we walk through the slide and the highlight from that law. And you'll see again, here's the notes section. We give the answer to the quiz question. This is important to note because if you do send out the materials beforehand, you have to take off that little red bubble. This is something I talk about in the introductions and tips page, that little document. You have to delete that little red bubble around true, because when you print the PDF, it prints that red bubble, and then you'll send out the PDF with all the answers, and so then it takes all the fun out of it. Got to always keep the fun in. We try to give some examples. You can say all of what's on this slide, some of what's on this slide, but this information is in there to help flesh out this slide. So there's one of these slides for each of those rules that we talk about in the beginning slide. Again, there's where you can see where we say that the answer is true. So the next section is one where we just wanted to give a few brief points about just what this slide says, how a board of directors operates. We have found that there are some key sort of foundational understandings that just would be helpful to get right out there. So this is a section of the presentation that you might encourage community action agencies to incorporate as part of their orientation if you're finding that this is an issue in their state. We talk about several sort of key points in this. I'm only going to focus on one today, and that is how a board should directly operate. We do talk about committees in this section, a little bit about bylaws. So I suggest looking at this section for those reasons. So I just wanted to point out, this is another example of the different interactive exercises that we've put into this presentation. Every section has some type of interactive exercise, whether it's a quiz question, whether it's a scenario, whether it's a true false, whether it's an exercise asking them to actually take a moment and write some information down and share it with the group. So we put this scenario in here, and when you go to the notes section, there is the answer, and it gives you our thoughts on this scenario. You may find that people say some additional things, and then after you talk about that scenario, we do have some slides that go a little deeper into the operational framework of a board of directors. We found a lot of issues around board members acting individually and not as a body. So we wanted to be as clear as possible about how a board of directors operates, when they should operate, when individual board members would act, well, that they are only acting on behalf of the full board, and when they would act as individuals rather than going through the executive director to address certain issues. So all of these slides are annotated, and you can read about all of the different scenarios in the different slides. As you can see here, it's animated in the way in which we think you might talk about this information. So that's just to give you a snippet of what's in that section. And then with the role of the tripartite board, we're really focused here on fiduciary duties. And you can see thus far why it's really essential to have a separate presentation for public CAAs. Public CAAs are not going to be subject to the Nonprofit Corporation Act. Public CAAs, because they're not subject to the Nonprofit Corporation Act, are not going to necessarily be subject to the fiduciary duties that live in the Nonprofit Corporation Act. However, you know, we recommend that the Public CAA Tripartite Board adopt those fiduciary duties, because that is, you know, a good way for board members to ensure accountability, even the Tripartite Board of a Public CAA. However, they're not required to do so. So these are important points that need to be made. That is why a public CAA operates differently than a nonprofit CAA. So I just pulled out here the duty of loyalty, and I mainly did that because I wanted to show you that for this sort of activity, we have scenarios here. These scenarios are based on questions we've been asked about the duty of loyalty, really whether or not a elected public official or private sector board member or low-income representative has a conflict of interest with the community action agency, and sort of how you would handle that conflict of interest we talk about a little bit later on in the slides. But this is a great slide to stimulate conversation among the board members that you're training, or that this community action agency may be training. So then the last section of this presentation focuses on key responsibilities of the tripartite board. Again, as I mentioned, there are 6 additional smaller sections that go a little deeper into each of these areas. We found at Cap Law that rather than just walk through all the organizational standards and sort of have a list, it's better if we can kind of consolidate the information and sort of some key overarching principles, and that's what these are intended to, this is what they're intended to do. And so I just pulled out here the generating funds section, just a few slides from that, so you could just get a feel for what that looks like. Each of the key board responsibility sections begin with a header slide like this one. You'll see here we talk about sort of the 2 main ways that CAAs generate funds, and we talk, and you'll see in the notes section, and that's why these asterisks are here. We talk about the responsibility of each of who has the responsibility in the organization, generally with regards to these 2 main ways for generating funds. You'll also see on the next slide, the activity we've included in this section is a generating funds quiz. I think there's also another activity later on. Again, it's intended to stimulate conversation, get people thinking about this topic and this information, which is really important, especially for community action agency boards to do so. So that really ends my section of this presentation. I haven't left Jarl much time. I thought that might happen, but I really wanted to give you guys a sense, a flavor of all the different parts and how you could use those different parts in your own training. Happy to talk offline with anyone regarding these materials. I also want to say, if you find you're in a presentation and it's gone off on a different, in a tangent that you think is important to maybe address, but you don't have an answer to, please feel free to say, you know, let me take that down. I'm going to contact Cap Law and ask them this question, and we're happy to help in that way. All right, Straw, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Allison. But before we move on, any comments, questions, reflections on what Allison has talked about?
A question has come in. Often when folks request board training, they're asking because they have a specific problem. If we find if we have some very specific issues that aren't addressed, can we ask for some additional slides that are perhaps more on point?
And
you can always,
yeah, go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, I was going to say you can always ask, and you should always ask. whether or not, we'll be able to help with that is going to really depend on the issue. But yeah, feel free to ask. It may be that we have slides already that we can just tweak and give to you. It may be that we just have some resource material that we'll pass along to you that could help you create some slides. So, don't hesitate to ask. What would be helpful, though, is if you did, please do contact either CAPLA or the partnership with those topics, because if enough CAAs contact about those type of topics, it may generate us developing another type of training resource that could be used by everyone in the network. So yeah, definitely always contact us with more specific information. It also may be that your specific topic might actually be addressed, but this may not be as self-evident, so I could help with that as well.
Right, and we definitely want your feedback, your questions, and suggestions for additional resources that we can build out. We have another question. Will these PowerPoints be a work in progress? Should we download them, or is it best to always be gathered from the CAPLA website? We do intend to update these slides, hopefully on at least a semi-regular basis, and it should be easy enough for us to just put in a version notation on the slide so you would know what version you have if there are changes or updates made to those main slide decks. I think for the most part, we're probably going to be adding additional modules just to continue to build out the material available. But we'll work in that version number just so you know which one you're working with if you've downloaded it previously and come back 6 months later.
I will add that because we want to use the event in January to and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes, where you'll see more of the content being presented. So you can certainly, it's live now, right? You can download the stuff, but probably in January we would probably see the current final version until there are those semi-regular updates. But you feel free to download now, play with them now, whatever you want to do with them.
Yep.
Yeah, and just real quick, and to that point, if you do have a chance, it would be helpful if you do have a chance just to review it a little bit, because as Denise said, I think one of the thoughts now, we'll talk about this more later, either on this call or in January before MLTC, but one of the thoughts now is to actually do some role-playing with using these materials. So, yeah. So getting a little familiar with them before that would be great.
Very helpful.
And another question, the content is great and the use of scenarios is useful. I'm wondering if we have the ability to select from a catalog of scenarios, since we're often asked to address a specific concern. And Allison, I'm sure you can flesh this out, but I know CAPLA has developed some really good trainings that use that sort of interactive scenario-based approach. So Allison, your thoughts on continuing to build that out?
Well, as far as I know, Sears has gone out of business. There's no more catalogs of anything. I'm kidding. So, I will say the thought crossed my mind as well that, the scenarios are really there to give an idea and address a very particular point. I'm hoping that, maybe the best way to put this is, if you as a trainer have come up with a scenario that you would like to have addressed, you think there are specific points that scenario is addressing that are generally applicable to a training session, we're happy to review that and say, yeah, that's great, or you know what, you're right, but I would tweak it because there is confusion around X point that you may not realize. So you should definitely use us as a sounding board. We unfortunately can't anticipate all the different scenarios. Our scenarios were created, again, to really address some very specific points. You may give that scenario and all kinds of different points come out of it, and that'll be interesting for us to know about. And again, as I said before, we're happy to have further discussions with you if you find that that's happening and you need some more feedback from us in order to train with that slide. But yeah, I see that the next question, or if at some point all of us could contribute scenarios to CAPLA, could we have a point person to send them to? Yeah, so I think if you are going to contribute scenarios, this is what I would ask. You're more than welcome to send us scenarios, and you can just actually send them to Cap Law info. I think it's Cap Law, or info@caplaw.org, and I will get them, and we'll figure that out. Or you can send them directly to me at my email address, or Ashley Billingsley or Ellie Inander, our new communications person. But if you are going to send us a scenario, need the scenario, but also need what you think are the takeaways from that scenario. That's what's important. Oh, and Liza put info@caplaw.org in the chat box. So I believe that's the right one. If that changes, if I'm wrong about that, I'll let Liza know, and maybe she can update everybody with the right email address. But yes, please send us what you anticipate or what you're hoping people will learn from that scenario, because that's the key with scenarios, is what you think what you're trying to educate people on. All right, I'm done. Sorry.
Another comment, perhaps we could develop a best practice resource for some of the specific concerns. And I think that's kind of where you were headed in some of your scenarios, things that you typically see questions being asked. But yeah, I think in the same sort of collection of scenarios, if there are some best practice, we could look at developing some best practice responses to some very specific concerns.
And I think that also underscores why it's so important that we just have a continuing dialogue. We want to hear from you about what's working, where the challenges are, where do we need additional resources, and so I think that kind of ongoing discussion will really make sure that we're targeting the right issues, and we're also providing the most helpful resources we can. And anything else, Allison?
Yeah, I was going to say, too, it might be interesting and I know that's what we're going to do with this next step, maybe to segue on into there. It might be interesting as part of next steps for people to come. I mean, you guys, this is off the cuff, so if Denise and Charles don't want to do this, that's fine. But for people to bring their scenarios to MLTC, and we won't be able to, of course, deal with all of them, but maybe take some of those and talk about how you would turn those into a training tool or point, and work together as a group to do that. That's something, because that's a key point, I think, in making this information accessible and stick with people, is having those scenarios. So sort of talking about how we do it and how we use them, and getting feedback from others who have been using scenarios or exercises and how successful they've been, that I think be useful for everyone. So I'll just throw that out there.
No, that's a great idea, and that's a nice segue, I think, into the next steps component. So the next time this group is gathering by web meeting to prepare for the January conference is Friday, January 4th at 2 o'clock Eastern, 11 o'clock Pacific, and everyone else kind of in between there. We're going to be going further into the content and laying the groundwork for what we hope will be on that Friday in New Orleans, a chance to practice, to hear each other, to get elevate the comfort level with the content. We're also, something else that just was flying through my mind, and Allison can slap me later if she wants to, but we really hope that you can start offering these kind of trainings at your conferences. So if we're looking ahead even to the conference season, if you think of the next meeting on the 4th of January to get a bit more comfortable, the MLTC event to do even more comfort level, we can co-train with you. Maybe that's an opportunity to try to get even more comfortable with some of this core content at your state association and/or regional conferences. There's a lot of ways to try to develop the comfort level. Because when you hear Allison do a Cap Law board training, I mean, she can whip off the stuff like nothing. She's got the humor, she's got the fun, she can make bylaws sound interesting, and that's because of the years of experience that Allison has. Oh, so many years of experience. But you're not going to get comfortable right off the bat. That was for you, Allison. So our job is to try to help you get as comfortable as possible with this material. So you were on today, which is great. We're going to send out a recording of this, and we hope you join us on the 4th, and we hope you join us in New Orleans as well.
Right, and so that webinar on the 4th is really also your additional opportunity to give us ideas about what's going to be most helpful, really shape that session in a way that you get the most out of it. So hopefully this has already sparked some thinking, and again, we'll continue the conversation after the holidays.
There's another...
Yep.
Next slide. Yep.
All right, and so just closing, any comments, questions, thoughts, and we can pick this up, obviously, at the next webinar and in New Orleans when we convene at MLTC. But any other additional ideas for resources, thoughts about how to disseminate the slides, get these trainings out here? And we'll take compliments, well thought out training rollout plan. So thank you very much. We've really, and Allison especially has been working very hard on these slides, but it's been a group effort to sort of figure out how to get these out, how to support you. But any other closing thoughts, ideas? And again, we'll pick up this conversation after the holidays, and you're more than welcome to follow up with us offline if you have any ideas or suggestions.
One thing I will just remind folks, this came out of the regional TNTA initiative meeting, the first one we had. Now, it took a while for it to go through the process. You can see the extent of it. We weren't looking to just do a flyby. We know this is a hard topic to really do a deep dive into, so we spent the time doing it. But it is a product of those TNTA meetings that the associations were seeking. So I hope that you're seeing that those comments just don't go into the ether, that they come out with some hopefully practical tools. Now, not all the associations were on here today, so we will send out a recording and the slides to everybody and reminding them of the January meeting and reminding them of the meeting in New Orleans as well. But whatever you can do to give us feedback, shoot us an email. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So.
Yep. And last thing, for those of you who haven't filled out your RPIC survey, please do so. We need all of your feedback from our state association. So I will send out a reminder email again with that link. Thank you to those of you who have already filled that out. And again, have a happy holidays, and we will see you hopefully in New Orleans.
Those comments, anyone? I think we're good. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Allison.